Today's video partner, FX's Shogun, has inspired me to look at the dining habits of the samurai and shogun of the late Sengoku period, around the year 1600. So I've recreated a meal using Japanese recipes from the period. So thank you to FX for partnering with me on this video as we cook for the Shogun, this time on Tasting History. So FX's Shogun, which is inspired by actual events and real historical figures, takes place in the year 1600 at the end of the Sengoku period and follows a century-defining civil war between Lord Yoshi Toranaga and his enemies on the Council of Regents. This was a period of great change in Japan, not just political because of a basically century of civil war, but also great changes in the culture and the cuisine. In 1543, the Portuguese, who the Japanese termed Nanban, or Southern Barbarians, had arrived on the shores of Japan and began a century of culinary exchange. And the series delves into how the Portuguese really affected the politics of Japan at this time, especially the introduction of Catholicism. But I figured I would focus on how they impacted Japanese cuisine. So I'm going to be making a chicken and rice dish that comes from a Japanese cookbook from the period called the Nanban ryōri, or Southern Barbarians Cookbook, which is filled with Portuguese influence, as well as a dish called Namasu No, or Food with Vinegar, using the 17th century cookbook Ryōri Monogatari as a guide. And that one actually has to sit overnight, so we will start with that. Now, the cookbook has several recipes for different namasu, most of which are vinegared fish, but some are vegetables, like sliced daikon and such. And such kind of leaves room for interpretation. We can use pretty much any vegetable that would have been available at the time. Now, today, this dish is still made usually using daikon and carrot. But in FX's Shogun, there is this wonderful scene where they're talking about the hair color of an Englishman, and they're comparing it to daikon and to gobo, which is burdock root. So that is what I'm going to be using. But first, we have to make our vinegar. And for that, what you'll need is 1.5 cups or 350 milliliters of rice vinegar and 1/3 cup or 65 grams of sugar. You're also going to need a small square of salted kombu or dried seaweed. So mix the vinegar and the sugar in a pot and then add the kombu and heat it to a gentle boil, letting the sugar dissolve. Then take it off the heat and let it cool completely. And while it does, you can peel your daikon and your gobo. Then chop both into thin sticks just a couple of inches long. Mix those together in a bowl and sprinkle with salt, about 2 teaspoons, and then give them a toss so the salt coats everything. The original recipe says it is important to season with salt. Salt should be added once. When salt is added 2 or 3 times, the preparation goes bad and it loses flavor. And the salt isn't just for flavor, but also it helps to draw out a lot of the moisture from the vegetables. So mix the salt with the strips and then leave it to rest for about 5 minutes and then squeeze out as much liquid as you possibly can from the vegetables. Then once they're well squeezed, take the kombu out of the vinegar and pour the vinegar over the sliced daikon and gobo. So ideally, you want these to be completely submerged. So using like a dish will work really well, but I've actually found that the best way to do this is the way that my dad does it when he makes this dish, and that's to put it into a plastic bag, and then you can put that in the fridge for about 24 hours. Now, for the dish that has a Portuguese influence, the Nanban dish, I am making a dish that they called simply Nanban ryōri, or Southern Barbarian dish. The recipe says, boil a chicken to make a broth. Color the stock with gardenia. Add black pepper, a bit of clove, ginger, garlic, and green onion to well-polished rice. Cook this in the stock. Place pieces of the chicken over the rice. So this dish is really cool because you're getting flavors like clove that you don't really find in a lot of Japanese cuisine today, but then you're also getting ingredients that are very much Japanese and not at all Portuguese, especially the gardenia. And now he doesn't talk about exactly how to make the broth, but most broths at the time in other cookbooks are made with dashi, which is a mixture of kelp and dried bonito flakes called katsuobushi. And you'll take about 2 tablespoons and add it to 3 quarts or 3 liters of cold water. Then you'll also need a couple pounds of chicken. And you can use a whole chicken that you've carved up, or you can just use disparate pieces, maybe a couple breasts, a thigh, some legs, but you definitely want a fair number of bones in there because that's what you're really going to use to make the stock. So add the chicken into the dashi water and set it over medium-high heat and bring it to a boil. Skim off any foam from the top and then reduce the heat to low and let it simmer for 30 to 40 minutes or until the meat is cooked through. Mainly you want to look at the chicken breast, you don't want to overcook that. But all of the rest of the meat you leave in there. So take out the breast once it's cooked, everything else that has a bone, leave it in. Let that all simmer for another 2 hours and it should reduce to about 1 liter of liquid. Once it's reduced, take it off the heat and strain it through some cheesecloth. And then comes the gardenia. So these are the fruit of a type of gardenia that is native to southern China. And since time immemorial, ancient times, the Chinese and a little bit later the Japanese have been using this to dye food, clothes, paper, all sorts of things yellow. All you do is break them up and then drop the whole pod into the broth. I'm using 4. Let them steep for about 30 minutes and then strain them out and you should be left with a nice yellow broth. Now while your broth is yellowing, you can start your rice, for which you'll need 300 grams of well-rinsed Japanese white rice. Then a large pinch of black pepper, a pinch of clove, a half teaspoon of minced garlic, and a half teaspoon of minced ginger, as well as a couple teaspoons of chopped green onion. Mix that all together with the rice and then put it all into a pot or a rice cooker and then measure out 1.5 cups or 350 milliliters of the broth and add it to the rice and then let it cook. Now in addition to this rice, I'm also going to have some white rice because any meal for the shogun would have included white rice. Because most of what the shogun ate from day to day, or samurai in general ate from day to day, wasn't all that different from what most everyone else was. It was usually some soup and or some fish, and some pickled vegetables. That was the general meal. The quality of it might be different depending on how much money you had, but that was the meal. The big difference came in what grain you ate, because most of the population ate millet and were lucky to get some brown rice. If you had money, maybe you ate all brown rice, but only the wealthiest of people could afford polished rice, or white rice as we know it today. So that is what a samurai might have eaten as an average meal. But I want to know what it would have been like if the shogun was coming over for dinner. So let's say you're a samurai, and one day you get a message letting you know that the shogun has decided to come and stay with you for a visit. Lucky you. So these official visits, called onari, were great honors, but they were really, really expensive. Yes, you were going to be getting some gifts from the shogun, but you also had to give him gifts, so it's kind of a wash. Plus, you had to prepare a massive banquet for him and all of his retainers. Now, these banquets would vary in size depending on the time period and who the vassal was who was throwing it and all sorts of different things, but in general, they were very, very expensive, and they usually started with drinking. It would all begin with the shiki sankon, or ceremony of the 3 rounds of sake. Now, this was not just an excuse to have some sake. It wasn't like happy hour. No, everything about this and the ceremony in general, the entertainment that day, all of the eating and the food, everything was imbued with a lot of symbolism and meaning. But there was also drinking. And it was a good amount of drinking because, yes, it was 3 rounds of sake, but each round had 3 drinks of sake in it, so in all it was 9 drinks of sake. And these drinks were served in sakazuki, or shallow bowls meant for sake, which would have been shared with someone else. João Rodrigues, a Portuguese Jesuit interpreter who spent some time in Japan at the end of the 16th century, wrote about the importance of drinking from these bowls of sake among the samurai elite. He says that often they would be shared between 2 friends as a sign of camaraderie, or 2 enemies as a sign of forgiveness or reconciliation. And because of this, turning down a drink was a real sign of enmity, so you never wanted to do that. And while this all sounds maybe convivial, it was a weighty affair. It is performed when they make a conspiracy, alliance, or promise which must be fulfilled at all costs. They also do this when they take oaths of loyalty to each other, sometimes mixing in the wine some drops of blood, which both draw by pricking their finger, and then both drink the wine mixed with blood. So 3 rounds of sake, 3 drinks around, 9 drinks of sake before there has been any food. That's all on an empty stomach. Now, they did have some pass-around appetizers, for lack of a better term, at the ceremony, but you didn't get to eat them. The foods brought around would be things like dried chestnuts, dried abalone, or dried kelp. And each food was filled with symbolism, but usually served in a form that was completely inedible. So if you couldn't eat the appetizers, then what did you do? Well, you pretended to eat them. Take the second strand of flattened abalone from the front and bring it up to your mouth, and then tuck it away into your pocket. Though depending on the setup, sometimes there were some edible appetizers available at the ceremony of the 3 rounds of sake. One culinary text from 1497 says, "At times when there has been a long interval of sake drinking after a light meal, it is appropriate to serve chilled barley noodles as a snack." Now, the order of the day's events could vary depending on the time period or who was throwing it, all sorts of different things. But in general, at some point during the day, you would have a gift exchange, and there you might have snacks. During a visit from the Shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu in 1624, they served grilled fowl, seafood, and vegetable dishes, mochi, and sake during the exchange. The host and the shogun and his retainers then gave each other gifts of silver, fine clothes, horses, and swords. And then everyone was entertained with dances, music, and theater. No and kyogen, the 2 most favored forms of theater by the shoguns. No was usually a dramatic play, and then kyogen was a comedy. As they watched, they ate these buns that were filled with bean paste, and then afterward, the shogun gifted kimono and money to the performers. And only after all of this was it time for the actual banquet. Now, this banquet was served in a style called honzen ryōri, which was an elaborate and very expensive way of presenting the food. And it was developed by the samurai class in the 15th century, but it remained in some forms in Japan until the early 20th century. I actually think that there are still some restaurants in Japan that will do this, and if I ever get to Japan, hopefully fairly soon, I want to find one of those restaurants and do that. Anyway, in the Sengoku period, it went a little something like this. Everyone would be seated on the floor, the shogun in a prominent spot, showing his place in the samurai hierarchy. Then everyone else sat in order of importance. And everything about this event was all about your place in the social order. Not just where you sat, but when you got to eat, what foods you got to eat. Actually, not even got to eat, but just had presented to you, because again, you didn't get to eat everything. How they were presented was on 3 trays. Sometimes this is called main tray service or main tray style. Rodriguez actually described this style of banquet when he witnessed one around the year 1600. Nowadays, at banquets, they usually place 3 principal trays in front of each guest. All the trays are generally of white cedar wood, square in shape and with legs a span in height. The tray placed in the center is the highest and has another tray on either side. And each tray would have a different number of dishes. The most formal way to do it was the main tray would have 7 side dishes, the next would have 5, and then 3. Interestingly, at times there would actually be a 4th tray available, but they never called it tray 4. Instead, they would call it the additional tray. And that's because the Japanese word for 4, shi, was a homonym for the Japanese word for death, shi. And I guess nobody wanted to eat off the death tray. So you've got your trays. You've got 7 sides, 5 sides, and 3 sides. But in addition to that, each tray would also have a soup. And on the main tray, you also had a big old bowl of rice in the lower left-hand corner, as well as a salt cellar. And so now you've got all this food before you. What do? You don't eat. That's definitely what you don't do, because you needed to wait for social cues from the people above you to let you know when it was time to eat and what you could eat. But nobody was eating anything until everyone had taken ample time to appreciate the visual aspects of the meal. Just like the pre-dinner entertainment, every aspect of the food was theater. It was all about the presentation. Sometimes the preparation was even theatrical. There was something called shikibocho, which was a knife ceremony where the hochonin, or carving knife men, would fillet a fish or carve a large fowl using only a blade and never touching it with their hands. And sometimes these men would create big elaborate dishes that would just kind of set at the center for everyone to admire, whether it was a completely roasted and then refeathered duck that was positioned positioned in a way to look like it was getting ready to fly off. These things were there just for their beauty. And these big dishes were, of course, filled with a lot of symbolism, but so were all of the little dishes on your tray, down to every single ingredient, even down to the colors. Every tray was meant to have 5 colors: yellow, red, green, white, and black. What's interesting is that even all the way back in the 14th century, they considered red and yellow colors that would stimulate the appetite. And today, they still consider that to be true. If you look at the logo of so many fast food restaurants, they're all yellow, red, or yellow and red. Now, if you were a cook and you were trying to find all these different colors, there were texts that would clue you in. Use conger eel for the color white. Bonito is for the color red. Black is made from dried sea cucumber. Green is shark. Yellow is dried squid. It is best to slice these finely. So much to look at and admire even before it's time to eat. And when it does finally become time to eat, you needed to do it in a very specific manner. One text from the 16th century says that a diner begins by wetting their chopsticks in the soup on the main tray and picking up the rice bowl. After eating rice, sip the soup, but do not eat any morsels in it. After that, you take your chopsticks and pick up a single piece of salt, and then you go for more rice, and then more soup, and only then can you finally try one of the sides on your tray, provided that it's edible. In these banquets, many of the dishes were served on plates in the form of pyramids, neatly arranged with their corners as in the Chinese fashion. And it was from China that they derived their origin. But they were served only for decoration and were there to be looked at and not eaten. These were called takamori, or high serving, and just like with the sake ceremony, you would pretend to eat these. Remove the chopsticks from the tray, or pretend to remove them, and signify that you have eaten by making a noise with the chopsticks. At many of these banquets, the only foods that were actually meant to be eaten were the soups, the rice, and a couple of the sides, namely the pickled vegetables or their highly thought of raw fish cut into small pieces. Along with it, there will be a dish containing a tart sauce, or one which burns like mustard, and this takes away the rawness of the fish. Many of these dishes were so elaborately designed that it would have been seen as an insult to the person who prepared it should you eat it. And then sometimes they were prepared in such a way that they did become completely inedible. One description of how abalone should be served says to attach streamers to the abalone, then as a base attach 7 or 9 waves made of paper of 5 colors cut into round pieces. The thing is, while having a bunch of inedible food on your plate today might seem a little unorthodox, in the 16th century, even the Europeans would have been very used to that. In Europe, they were often refeathering peacocks or swans, or they had pies that you would cut into only to have snakes or live birds fly out of them. Completely inedible, but that was not the point. It was all about the spectacle. One of the Japanese creations from this period that I would love to see actually made in person is a spiny lobster in the shape of a boat. The shell is opened and the meat is served upon it. Raise the feelers up like a ship's masts and stand the legs off to the sides. It is best served with painted decorations on it in silver and gold. Now there are records of these banquets where you've got the 3 trays, but then you've got 3 versions of each of the 3 trays coming out. So like 9 trays in all. You could have up to like 30 dishes come out in front of you for one of these very, very long banquets, most of the dishes being inedible, which is why sometimes after the banquet, they would have a godan, or after meal, where more hearty, regular food dishes would be served so people could actually fill up, because they still needed to eat something. And maybe they were dishes like the ones that I'm about to finish up. So once the rice is cooked, dish it up and lay some of the cooked chicken on top. And then you can decorate with a bit of green onion or black sesame seeds. And then take the namasu and place that in a small bowl and chop up the kombu that you had used to make the sugar vinegar and put a little bit of that on top. And I'll also include some white rice as well as pickled vegetable, which would have been present on all of the trays. And here we are, A meal fit for the Shogun. My chopstick skills are not that great, so I'll start with the rice. That is super flavorful. That's actually wonderful. You're just getting a hint of the clove and these spices that you don't usually get in Japanese cooking. But then because of the dashi that we added to the broth, it still is very much a Japanese flavor. Let me try this chicken. Considering it's boiled chicken, it's very flavorful. And then the daikon and gobo. I will first try the daikon, which is the radish. That is so good. I love daikon radish. What I love though is you first get the sweetness of the sugar that's in it, but then the vinegar really hits, and it's like this acidic, but pleasantly acidic feel in the mouth. It's wonderful. Now the burdock root, which I've never had before. Crispy. It's good. You know what it reminds me of? Is jicama, if you've ever had jicama. Actually, that's really, really good. I could eat a whole bowl of this. I probably will. Now, I didn't make the pickled radish, which is also daikon, but if you've never had this, it's one of my favorite Japanese foods in the world. It's got this funky flavor that I really cannot describe. You've got to find it. It's this mix of sweet and sour and funk, but like a pleasant funk. Like, think cheese has a nice funk sometimes. This has a nice funk. They're not the same funk, but it's a good funk. So thank you again to FX's Shogun for partnering with me on this video. New episodes on Hulu every Tuesday, just like this show. So Tuesdays can be your Shogun and Tasting History day, and I will see you next Tuesday on Tasting History.